She was handed a rusty key and told it was worthless. Her own father looked her dead in the eyes on her 18th birthday, not with love, not with regret, but with the cold satisfaction of a man discarding a bad investment. No inheritance, no future, no family. Just a rotting, abandoned cabin buried deep in the mountains, and a key so old it crumbled rust into her trembling palm. He wanted her gone. What he didn't want her to find was what was hidden 60 feet beneath that cabin floor. And the moment she did, the most powerful man she had ever feared became the most terrified. Rain lashed furiously against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gallagher estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, blurring the manicured lawns into a sea of dull gray. Chloe Gallagher stood shivering in the center of the mahogany-paneled study, her canvas duffel bag clutched tightly against her chest. Today was her 18th birthday. There was no cake, no celebration, no warmth. Instead, there was only the icy, unyielding glare of her father, Richard Gallagher, the ruthless CEO of Gallagher Global Logistics. "You made your choice, Chloe," Richard sneered, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored Brioni suit. He didn't look at her like a daughter. He looked at her like a bad investment. "I offered you a guaranteed executive position at the firm. I arranged a brilliant future for you with Preston Kensington. All you had to do was study corporate law and play the part. Instead, you throw away your legacy for what? Environmental science? A pointless degree at a state college?" Beatrice, Chloe's stepmother, stood gracefully by the roaring fireplace, sipping a glass of expensive Pinot Noir. A thinly veiled smirk danced on her lips. "Richard, darling, please don't upset yourself. You knew this would happen. She's always been exactly like her mother. Headstrong, unpredictable, ungrateful." Chloe bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. "My mother built half of this company before you pushed her out, Dad. And Grandpa Nathaniel—" "Do not speak of my father in this house." Richard slammed his fist onto the antique desk, rattling a pair of heavy crystal tumblers. The sudden violence in his voice made Chloe take a step back. Nathaniel was a delusional old fool who lost his mind in his final years. He walked away from his own empire, leaving me to clean up his mess. He died with nothing but debts and that wretched, rotting pile of timber in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. And since you love his memory so much, you can have it." Richard picked up a heavy brass letter opener and carelessly slid a small, faded manila envelope across the polished mahogany. It slid off the edge, landing with a pathetic slap at Chloe's worn canvas sneakers. "There's the deed to his cabin," Richard said, his voice dropping to a terrifying absolute calm. "As of this exact moment, your trust fund is dissolved. Your credit cards are canceled. Your phone plan is deactivated. You are no longer a part of this family, and you are no longer a Gallagher. Get out of my house before I have private security throw you off the property." Chloe bent down, her fingers trembling uncontrollably as she picked up the envelope. Inside rested a single heavy iron key, mottled with decades of rust. It belonged to the cabin her grandfather, Nathaniel Gallagher, had retreated to during the last 10 years of his life. Nathaniel had been a brilliant logistics engineer, a man who built a shipping empire from the ground up, only to abruptly walk away from society, leaving the company to Richard. Nathaniel died when Chloe was 14. His last will had explicitly stated that the cabin was to be transferred to Chloe on her 18th birthday. Richard had fought it in probate court for 4 agonizing years, claiming the land was prime real estate that belonged to the corporation, but he had mysteriously dropped the $1 million lawsuit just days ago. Without shedding a single tear in front of them, Chloe turned her back on the only home she had ever known. She walked out through the massive oak front doors and into the freezing October rain, tossing her bag into the back seat of her beat-up 1998 Subaru Outback, the only possession in her name that Richard couldn't legally seize. As she drove away from the towering wrought iron gates of the estate, the adrenaline faded, leaving a hollow, terrifying panic in her chest. She pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway and checked her banking app. She had precisely $412 in her checking account, a half tank of gas, and nowhere to go. The drive from Connecticut to the deep, unforgiving mountains of North Carolina took nearly 9 grueling hours. The massive interstate highways faded into winding state routes, which eventually morphed into unpaved, treacherous logging roads flanked by towering skeletal pine trees. Her grandfather had been her only true ally in the family. While Richard demanded absolute perfection and Beatrice constantly sowed discord, Nathaniel had been her sanctuary. He had taught Chloe how to carve wood, how to navigate by the stars, and how to look beneath the surface of the world. "The world only sees the fresh paint, Chloe," he used to tell her, his eyes twinkling with a secret, sorrowful amusement. "They never bother to check the canvas underneath." Night had entirely swallowed the forest by the time her headlights caught the reflective surface of a battered, rusted mailbox leaning heavily to one side. The faded white numbers read 842 Hollow Creek Road. She pulled onto the heavily overgrown gravel driveway, her tires spinning in the mud. The cabin emerged from the shadows like a forgotten ghost. It was far worse than she had imagined. The roof sagged heavily under the weight of wet pine needles. The wooden porch steps were rotted entirely through, and thick, suffocating ivy had swallowed half the exterior timber walls. This was her grand inheritance, a derelict shack in the middle of absolute nowhere. For a fleeting, heartbreaking second, Chloe broke down over the steering wheel. She wondered if her father had been right all along. Had Nathaniel truly lost his mind? Sunlight broke through the dense canopy of pines the next morning, casting long, dusty beams across the cabin's desolate living room. Chloe woke up, shivering violently on a moth-eaten canvas sofa, a thin wool blanket she had found in the trunk of her car pulled tight around her shoulders. In the harsh, unforgiving light of day, the cabin looked even more depressing. Thick layers of dust coated every single surface. The floorboards warped under her feet, and the air smelled heavily of mildew, wet earth, and old paper. She spent the first few hours tearing down massive cobwebs and tossing out ruined, waterlogged furniture onto the front lawn. Her stomach growled fiercely, a sharp reminder of her rapidly dwindling bank account. She needed to figure out if she could sell the 20 acres of land, or at least make the cabin insulated enough to survive the coming winter months. Around noon, she heard the distinct crunch of heavy boots on the gravel outside. Chloe froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed a heavy, solid iron fire poker from the stone hearth and crept silently toward the front window, peering out through the grime-caked glass. A tall man in a red flannel shirt and a worn canvas work jacket was standing by her Subaru, inspecting her Connecticut license plate. Chloe pushed the front door open, keeping the iron poker hidden strategically behind her leg. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The man jumped, spinning around. He had a rugged, weather-beaten face, hands calloused from hard labor, and surprisingly kind hazel eyes. "Whoa, sorry there. Didn't mean to spook you. My name's Tobias Hayes. I live about 3 miles down the ridge. Nobody's been up at the old Gallagher place in nearly 4 years. Saw the tire tracks and thought maybe a squatter or some teenagers had moved in." "I'm Chloe," she said cautiously, taking a step onto the creaking porch. "Nathaniel Gallagher was my grandfather. It's my property now." Tobias let out a low, impressed whistle, removing his faded baseball cap to run a hand through his dark hair. "Well, I'll be damned. Nathaniel's granddaughter. You've definitely got his eyes." He paused, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "But listen, miss. Are you absolutely sure you're supposed to be here today? Your dad's corporate guys were just out here last week." Chloe gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning a stark white. "My dad? Richard Gallagher? Yeah, Tobias nodded. Had a whole team of aggressive surveyors and a private heavy-duty demolition crew up from Charlotte. Said the place was a massive structural safety hazard, and they were prepping to bulldoze the entire lot by the end of the month. I told them they couldn't just knock down Nathaniel's place without notice, but they flashed a stack of legal paperwork at me. Chloe's breath hitched. Richard had dropped the probate suit. He had handed her the deed yesterday because he knew she had no money and would run straight here. But why send a demolition crew before she even took possession? If the cabin was truly worthless, why spend tens of thousands of dollars to urgently bulldoze it to the ground? Tobias, Chloe said slowly, her mind racing with terrifying implications. Did they go inside the cabin? Tried to, Tobias replied, pointing at the front door. But Nathaniel installed solid steel-reinforced doors under the wood paneling back in 2012. You'd need an industrial blowtorch or the master key to get in. The crew got frustrated. They were planning to just level the whole structure with an excavator next Tuesday and sift through the rubble. Chloe swallowed hard. Thank you, Tobias. I think I need to be alone right now to figure this out. After Tobias left, assuring her that the neighbors kept a close watch on each other, Chloe locked the heavy door, her mind spinning. Her grandfather hadn't just retreated to the woods. He had heavily fortified this cabin. She began searching the room frantically, the exhaustion entirely replaced by adrenaline. She tore through old wooden bookshelves, emptied kitchen cabinets, and pulled up loose, rotting rugs. There had to be a reason Richard wanted this specific place destroyed so desperately. He didn't care about the heavily wooded land. He wanted to bury something. Hours passed. Covered in soot, sweat, and spider webs, Chloe collapsed onto the floorboards in front of the massive stone fireplace. She stared at the soot-stained bricks, utterly defeated. Her grandfather's cryptic words echoed in her mind again. The world only sees the paint, Chloe. They never bother to check the canvas. She pulled the rusted key out of her pocket. It had opened the front door smoothly, but looking at it closely in the sunlight, it was unusually long with incredibly intricate, asymmetrical teeth. It looked far too complex for a standard deadbolt. Chloe crawled toward the massive fireplace, running her trembling hands along the cold, rough stones of the hearth. She remembered how Nathaniel used to obsess over masonry, claiming that stones held deep memories. She pressed her fingers against the thick mortar. Nothing. She moved to the thick wooden mantelpiece, examining the intricate, hand-carved panorama of pine trees, bears, and wolves Nathaniel had whittled himself. Wait. The wolf carved on the far right edge. Its eye was an empty, incredibly deep hole, perfectly round and unlike any of the others. Chloe held her breath. Her hand shaking, she lifted the rusted key and slid it into the wooden wolf's eye. It slid in effortlessly. It fit perfectly. She turned the key to the right. A heavy mechanical clack echoed from deep behind the stone wall. Suddenly, the entire right side of the stone fireplace groaned in protest. Dust rained down onto the floorboards as a massive section of the brickwork slowly swung inward on completely hidden, heavy-duty steel hinges, revealing a dark, narrow concrete staircase leading straight down beneath the cabin's foundation. A rush of stale, freezing air hit Chloe's face. She pulled out her phone, turned on the bright LED flashlight, and gripped the iron fire poker tightly in her right hand. Step by terrifying step, she descended into the pitch-black darkness. The basement was absolutely nothing like the rotting, decaying cabin above. It was perfectly preserved, immaculately clean, and lined with thick, bunker-grade concrete walls. Modern high-end dehumidifiers hummed quietly in the corners, somehow still running on an independent power grid. At the center of the vast room sat a massive, state-of-the-art server rack, blinking with faint green and blue lights, connected to a sprawling off-grid solar battery bank. But it wasn't the glowing servers that made Chloe drop the heavy iron fire poker onto the concrete floor with a loud clang. Stacked neatly against the far wall were 10 wooden pallets. Atop them sat hundreds of heavy olive-green canvas bags. One of the bags had tipped over, spilling its contents onto the floor. Heavy, gleaming gold Krugerrand coins caught the light of her phone. Millions of dollars in untraceable physical wealth. And in the center of the room, spread across a massive steel drafting table, were hundreds of highly classified blueprints, legal contracts, and surveillance photographs. Pinned to the center of a large corkboard was a high-resolution photo of her father, Richard Gallagher, shaking hands with a notorious internationally sanctioned arms dealer. A thick red marker had been used to draw a vicious, jagged X over Richard's smiling face. Beneath the horrifying photograph, written in her grandfather's frantic, precise handwriting, was a massive leather ledger. It didn't track legitimate logistics, shipping routes, or cargo manifests. It tracked illegal weapons. It tracked political bribes paid to senators. It tracked the exact movements of contraband smuggled globally through the shadow networks of Gallagher Logistics. Nathaniel hadn't gone crazy. He had discovered that his own son had hijacked the family shipping empire, turning it into a front for a ruthless international criminal syndicate. And Nathaniel had spent the last 10 years of his life silently building the ultimate, indestructible kill switch. Chloe stepped toward the desk, her reflection catching in the dark monitor of a computer terminal. She picked up a heavy, leather-bound journal resting neatly on top of the ledger. The cover was heavily embossed with a single sentence in bright gold leaf. For Chloe, use the gold to survive, and use the truth to burn his empire to the ground. She wasn't just disowned, she was the executioner. Cold adrenaline flooded Chloe's veins as she stared at the glowing computer terminal in the subterranean bunker. The blinking green cursor on the massive, curved monitor seemed to taunt her. Nathaniel had meticulously prepared this digital guillotine, but the system was currently locked behind a brutal, military-grade encryption screen. A single prompt sat in the center of the dark display. Identify the canvas. Chloe sank into the heavy ergonomic chair, her mind racing back to the summers spent whittling wood on the porch above. The world only sees the fresh paint, Chloe. They never bother to check the canvas underneath. She placed her trembling fingers over the mechanical keyboard. What was the canvas? She thought about his favorite paintings, his favorite books, his old nautical maps. Then she remembered the day he showed her how to mix her own paints using crushed minerals and linseed oil. He had painted a small, crude picture of a sailboat on a piece of rough canvas and flipped it over to write a date on the back. It was the day her mother died. She typed swiftly. August 14th, 2006. The screen flashed red. Access denied. 2 attempts remaining. Panic gripped her throat. If this was a localized security system, failing the password could trigger a total hard drive wipe. She closed her eyes, trying to picture the exact carving on the fireplace upstairs. The wolf. The blind eye. His warnings about Richard. Your father builds cages, Chloe. I build keys. She opened her eyes. The canvas wasn't a literal painting. The canvas was the foundation of Gallagher Global Logistics. She typed the original incorporation date of the company, followed by the name of his first cargo ship. 1978, Providence. The screen turned a bright, solid blue. A progress bar zipped across the monitor, and suddenly thousands of nested folders spilled across the desktop. Chloe clicked on the master directory labeled The Carthage Files. What she saw made her stomach violently churn. Nathaniel hadn't just collected rumors. He had intercepted and downloaded terabytes of internal corporate communications, banking ledgers, and encrypted satellite photographs. She opened a folder marked Charleston Customs. It contained high-resolution images of Gallagher shipping containers, supposedly filled with heavy agricultural machinery bound for Eastern Europe, actively being unloaded by paramilitary groups. The invoices showed payments routed through phantom shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Another document, titled Project Chimera, detailed how Richard was bypassing federal export regulations by disassembling advanced drone technology and shipping the components disguised as civilian automotive parts. She needed to copy this data immediately. She frantically rummaged through the drawers of the steel drafting table until she found a heavy, rubberized flash drive. She plugged it into the terminal and began initiating a mass transfer. A progress bar appeared. Estimated time, 14 minutes. Suddenly, the heavy thud of a vehicle door slamming echoed from the world above. Chloe froze. The security monitors mounted above the server rack flickered to life. The exterior cameras, cleverly hidden within birdhouses and hollowed-out tree trunks, showed a sleek, black Cadillac Escalade parked aggressively on the front lawn. This was not the rough-around-the-edges demolition crew Tobias had mentioned. 4 men stepped out of the vehicle. They were dressed in sharp, dark tactical clothing, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. At the helm was a man Chloe recognized instantly from her father's corporate galas, Victor Sterling. Officially, Victor was the vice president of risk management at Gallagher Logistics. Unofficially, he was Richard's personal fixer, a man whose specialty was making multi-million-dollar problems permanently disappear. Victor pulled a suppressed handgun from his shoulder holster, gesturing for 2 of the men to flank the perimeter of the cabin. Chloe watched the screen in absolute horror. The data transfer was only at 30%. Above her, the floorboards groaned violently. They were using a heavy steel battering ram on the reinforced front door. Thud, thud, crack. The sound of splintering wood echoed down the concrete stairwell, followed by the heavy, measured footsteps of Victor Sterling entering the living room. "Tear the place apart." Victor's voice drifted down the shaft, cold and muffled. Richard said the old man was paranoid. Look for false walls, floor safes, anything out of the ordinary. And if the girl is here, you know the protocol. Chloe's breath hitched. The protocol. Her own father had ordered a hit on her. She watched the progress bar agonizingly crawl to 70%. Upstairs, she could hear them smashing the remaining furniture, tearing books from the shelves and ripping up the floorboards. It was only a matter of time before they scrutinized the massive stone fireplace. "Sir?" One of the mercenaries called out on the monitor. "The brickwork on this hearth. It's completely asymmetric. There are deep scrape marks on the floorboards, like the stone swings outward." Victor's face appeared in the frame of the hidden camera. "Find the release mechanism. Bring me a sledgehammer from the truck." Chloe didn't have time to wait. At 92%, she yanked the flash drive from the USB port, accepting whatever data she had managed to capture. She shoved the drive into her pocket, grabbed Nathaniel's leather ledger, and unzipped her canvas duffel bag. She aggressively dumped her clothes onto the floor and began stuffing handfuls of the heavy gold Krugerrand coins into the bag. She could only carry about 40 pounds of it before the bag became completely unmanageable, but it was enough to survive. She needed an exit. She scanned the bunker walls frantically. Behind the massive server rack, partially obscured by thick bundles of Ethernet cables, was a heavy, circular steel hatch. Nathaniel wouldn't have built a panic room without a secondary egress. She sprinted toward it, hauling the heavy duffel bag over her shoulder. She spun the rusty iron wheel. It groaned in loud protest, metal grinding against metal. Upstairs, Victor stopped dead. "Did you hear that? It came from beneath the floor. Blow the hinges on the fireplace. Now!" Chloe threw all her weight into the wheel, finally breaking the rust seal. The hatch swung open, revealing a dark, narrow, corrugated metal pipe sloping downward into the earth. She dove in head first, dragging the heavy bag of gold behind her, just as a massive explosion rocked the cabin above. Dust and concrete debris rained down into the bunker as the secret door was violently breached. Chloe scrambled down the pitch-black tunnel, her knees scraping against the cold, jagged metal. The pipe seemed to stretch on forever, the air growing damp and smelling heavily of iron and wet clay. Behind her, she heard the furious shouts of Victor's men flooding into the bunker. "The servers are wiped. She took the physical drives." Victor roared, his voice echoing down the pipe. "Find the tunnel exit. Call Richard and tell him the asset has gone rogue." Chloe pushed harder, her lungs burning, until she finally saw a faint sliver of moonlight. She pushed through a heavy grate, concealed by thick blackberry bushes, tumbling out into the freezing mud of the forest floor. She was roughly 200 yards away from the cabin, down near the edge of a roaring creek. She didn't look back. Clutching the heavy bag of gold to her chest, she sprinted through the dense, unforgiving woods, letting the sound of the rushing water mask her desperate footsteps. The Shadow War had officially begun. Rain slicked the neon-lit streets of Nashville, Tennessee, as Chloe parked the Subaru in a dark, forgotten alleyway behind a dilapidated strip mall. It had been 48 hours since she escaped the bunker. She had driven entirely off the main highways, sleeping in her car with the doors locked and a tire iron resting across her lap. She was exhausted, starving, and acutely aware that she was the most hunted woman on the East Coast. She pulled up the hood of her damp sweatshirt and walked into a brightly lit establishment behind barred windows called Dominic's Gold and Silver. The shop smelled intensely of cheap cigars and ammonia. The man behind the bulletproof glass barely looked up from his smartphone. Chloe slid 2 heavy Krugerrands through the metal slot. "I need cash, unmarked, small bills." The pawnbroker picked up a jeweler's loupe, inspecting the gold. His eyes widened slightly. "These are mint-condition South African imports. Real heavy. I can give you $3,000 for the pair. Take it or leave it." It was a blatant robbery. The coins were worth nearly 4 times that amount, but Chloe couldn't risk leaving a paper trail at a legitimate bank. "Deal," she said coldly. With a thick stack of $20 bills shoved into her pockets, she bought a cheap prepaid burner phone and a refurbished laptop from a nearby electronics store. She retreated to a dingy roadside motel, paid in cash, and locked the deadbolt. Sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress, she booted up the laptop and inserted the flash drive. She needed a megaphone. She needed someone with enough reach and credibility to take down a multi-billion-dollar empire without getting silenced themselves. She spent hours researching independent investigative journalists. Finally, she found him. Jonathan Reed, a Pulitzer Prize-winning senior correspondent for The Sentinel, an aggressive independent news bureau based out of Washington, D.C. Jonathan had a reputation for destroying corrupt corporate giants and flat-out refusing to reveal his sources. Using an encrypted email client, she sent him a single message. "I have the Carthage files. Gallagher Global Logistics is a front. Meet me in Memphis, Central Station, tomorrow at noon." She attached a single, heavily redacted invoice from the Charleston shipments as proof. Within 10 minutes, a reply flashed on her screen. "I'll be the guy reading a 1998 copy of Wired magazine. Bring everything." If you're already hooked on Chloe's story, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell here will keep you on the edge of your seat every single time. The next afternoon, the grand vaulted ceilings of Memphis's Central Station buzzed with thousands of frantic commuters. Chloe sat at a small circular table near a bustling coffee kiosk, her eyes darting nervously across the crowd. She spotted him easily. Jonathan Reed was in his late 40s, wearing a rumpled tweed jacket and holding the vintage magazine exactly as promised. She stood up, grabbed her coffee, and walked past him, dropping a small folded napkin onto his table. It read, "Follow me to the southbound platform, track 3." 10 minutes later, the train lurched forward, leaving the station behind. Chloe sat in a window seat, the heavy canvas bag resting securely at her feet. Jonathan slid into the seat opposite her, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You're Richard Gallagher's kid," Jonathan said quietly, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "The one who just got disowned. The tabloids are having a field day with you." "The tabloids don't know anything," Chloe replied, sliding the encrypted laptop across the small table. "My grandfather spent the last decade of his life compiling this. Richard is moving military-grade hardware for sanctioned cartels and paramilitary groups across Eastern Europe and Africa." Jonathan opened the laptop and began scrolling through the decrypted files. For a long time, the only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks. The color slowly drained from the seasoned journalist's face. "My God," Jonathan whispered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "This isn't just a corporate scandal. Half the Senate Maritime Committee is implicated here. There are wire transfers linking Gallagher Logistics to private mercenary outfits that the CIA has been trying to nail for years." "Can you publish it?" Chloe asked, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Can you take him down?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He was squinting at a specific series of offshore bank routing numbers detailed in Nathaniel's ledger. He pulled out a specialized reference drive from his own bag and cross-referenced the digits. "Chloe," Jonathan said slowly, looking up at her with a chilling expression. "Your grandfather missed a crucial layer. Look at the primary beneficiary on these Cayman shell accounts. Richard isn't the primary account holder. He's just a signatory." Chloe frowned, pulling the laptop closer. "Then who owns the accounts?" "An entity registered under the name B. Croft Holdings." Jonathan tapped the screen. "Does the name Croft mean anything to you?" Chloe felt the air leave her lungs. Her blood turned to ice. "Croft, that's Beatrice's maiden name. My stepmother." "Your father isn't the mastermind, Chloe," Jonathan said, his voice laced with dread. "He's the puppet. Beatrice is the handler. She was placed into your father's life to hijack the company from the inside and utilize its global logistics network for her syndicate. Richard disowned you to get you out of the blast radius, but he couldn't stop her from sending Victor Sterling after you." Before Chloe could process the horrifying revelation, Jonathan's burner phone vibrated aggressively against the table. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening in pure shock. He immediately slammed the laptop shut and grabbed Chloe's arm. "We need to get off this train at the very next stop," Jonathan ordered, his tone deadly serious. "Why? What's happening?" Chloe demanded, pulling back. Jonathan showed her the screen of his phone. It was a breaking news alert from CNN. "Nationwide manhunt. Heiress Chloe Gallagher wanted by the FBI in connection with the brutal murder of North Carolina resident Tobias Hayes and the domestic bombing of a remote mountain cabin, armed and extremely dangerous." Beatrice hadn't just destroyed the cabin. She had murdered Tobias, framed Chloe for the explosion, and weaponized the entire federal government against an 18-year-old girl. Chloe stared out the window as the landscape blurred past, the terrifying reality setting in. She wasn't just fighting a corrupt CEO anymore. She was at war with an international syndicate, and there was nowhere left to hide. Rain pounded mercilessly against the shattered skylights of an abandoned textile factory on the outskirts of Memphis. Jonathan had dragged Chloe off the train 2 stops early, hijacking a delivery truck to bring them to this forgotten, off-the-grid safe house. Dust motes danced in the pale beams of streetlights filtering through the grime-caked windows. Jonathan rapidly typed lines of code into a heavy military-grade field laptop, bypassing standard internet service providers to connect directly to an encrypted satellite uplink. "Beatrice's people have already compromised the cellular networks," Jonathan muttered, sweat pooling at his temples. "They pushed that FBI alert to isolate you. If you walk into a police station right now, you'll suffer a fatal accident in holding before you even see a lawyer." We have to broadcast the Carthage files to every major global news outlet simultaneously. It's the only way to shield you." Chloe paced the cracked concrete floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The heavy canvas bag of gold sat in the corner, feeling less like a lifeline and more like an anchor. "How long until the upload is complete?" 10 minutes, Jonathan said, hitting the enter key. A massive progress bar appeared on the screen, crawling painfully to 2%. Once this hits the dark web and the international press servers, Beatrice's shadow empire will evaporate. The Treasury Department, Interpol, and the CIA will have no choice but to act, but we are sitting ducks until that bar hits 100. Footsteps echoed from the lower levels of the factory, slow, deliberate, heavy. Chloe froze, her blood turning to ice. She backed away from the stairwell, her eyes darting around the cavernous room for a weapon. But there was only rusted machinery and empty wooden crates. Jonathan stopped typing, slowly reaching into his tweed jacket to draw a compact silver revolver. "Step away from the console, Mr. Reed," a cold, echoing voice commanded from the shadows. Victor Sterling emerged from the gloom, looking entirely unfazed by the treacherous weather. He held a suppressed tactical pistol aimed squarely at Jonathan's chest. 2 heavily armed mercenaries flanked him, their laser sights painting bright red dots on the journalist's jacket. "Victor," Chloe breathed, her voice trembling but defiant. "How did you find us?" "You left a digital footprint the size of a crater when you pinged that offshore account on the train," Victor replied, his face an emotionless mask. He gestured with his weapon toward the laptop. "Cancel the transfer. Now." "It's a dead man's switch," Jonathan lied smoothly, his hands raised. "I cancel it, and the data instantly fragments and emails itself to 1,000 random recipients." Victor smirked, stepping closer. "I've dealt with bluffs from better men than you. Shoot him." "Wait!" Chloe screamed, stepping directly between Victor's men and Jonathan. "Victor, you don't want to do this. You don't even know who you're really working for." Victor let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I work for your father, Chloe, and he is very, very disappointed in you." "My father is a puppet," Chloe yelled, her voice echoing off the brick walls. "Beatrice controls the offshore accounts. She controls Beecroft Holdings. Do you honestly think she's going to let you walk away once this is over? She blew up the cabin. She killed Tobias Hayes. She's cleaning house, Victor, and you are the hired help." Victor's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. For a professional who prided himself on total control, the mention of Beecroft Holdings struck a nerve. "My grandfather didn't just track the shipments," Chloe pushed forward, sensing his hesitation. "He tracked the payouts. Look at the screen, Victor. Look at the routing numbers." Jonathan, taking the cue, carefully tapped a single key. The screen split. On the left, the upload progress bar ticked past 60%. On the right, a detailed ledger appeared, showing regular, massive transfers from Beecroft Holdings to a private Swiss bank account. "That's your retirement fund, isn't it?" Chloe asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Look at the status." Victor squinted at the glowing monitor. The status next to his multi-million-dollar Swiss account flashed in bright red letters. "Liquidated. Funds routed." "She emptied your accounts an hour ago," Chloe said softly. "The moment we escaped the bunker, Beatrice knew the empire was collapsing. She's burning the evidence, Victor, and you're holding the match." The factory fell utterly silent, save for the relentless drumming of the rain. The laser sights on Jonathan wavered. Victor lowered his weapon just a fraction of an inch, his jaw clenching so hard it looked like it might shatter. He pulled a sleek satellite phone from his pocket and hit a speed dial. He waited 10 agonizing seconds. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." A robotic voice. Beatrice had cut the cord. Victor stared at the phone, then looked at Chloe. The cold, ruthless enforcer suddenly looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. Without a single word, Victor holstered his weapon, signaled his men, and turned on his heel, vanishing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. He wasn't going after Beatrice. He was disappearing into the wind. Ding. Chloe and Jonathan whipped around. The screen glowed a brilliant solid green. Transfer complete. Packets delivered to 412 global addresses. "It's done," Jonathan whispered, collapsing back into his chair. "It's over." By sunrise, the world as Chloe knew it had completely shattered. The Carthage files exploded across every major television network and digital newspaper on the planet. The sheer volume of evidence was irrefutable. Interpol issued immediate red notices. The FBI raided the Gallagher Logistics corporate headquarters in Manhattan, seizing servers and freezing billions in assets. Richard Gallagher was arrested on the manicured lawn of his Greenwich estate, looking utterly bewildered as federal agents slapped cuffs on his wrists. He had been completely blind to the magnitude of Beatrice's shadow operations. But his ignorance was not a legal defense. Beatrice almost made it out. She was intercepted on a private tarmac in Scottsdale, Arizona, attempting to board a Gulfstream jet bound for a non-extradition country. When the authorities searched her luggage, they found millions in bearer bonds and the exact detonator frequency used to destroy Nathaniel's cabin. A week later, Chloe stood on the muddy, blackened foundations of her grandfather's destroyed cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. The federal government had publicly cleared her of all charges, issuing a sweeping apology and hailing her as a national whistleblower. The air was crisp, smelling heavily of pine and turned earth. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy, rusted key, the only thing that had survived the fire unscathed. She had used the gold Krugerrands to hire the best environmental lawyers in the country. Gallagher Logistics was being dismantled and liquidated, but the pristine 20 acres of mountain forest remained entirely hers. "You were right, Grandpa," Chloe whispered to the wind, looking out over the endless sea of green trees. They didn't check the canvas. She smiled for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "But we did." Did you see that jaw-dropping twist coming? Chloe's journey, from a disowned teenager with $412 in her pocket to the fearless young woman who brought down an entire international crime syndicate, proves that the truth always finds a way out of the dark. If this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because every single week, we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories of courage, betrayal, and justice that will absolutely blow your mind. What would you have done with the gold? Drop your answer in the comments below. We read every single one.